Okay, thank you. So, for the sake of brevity, I'll be brief and skip some of my comments. I think I'll mainly focus on the impression you get out of this paper and out of literature that you can read maybe in the popular press about the benefits of globalization, the disappearance of the inflation output trade-off. I think The Economist had a big story on this a few weeks or a couple months ago about the effects of competition, global competition and so forth, mitigating the effects, the traditional effects of the inflation output trade-offs and so forth. So I think in that sense this paper fits very well with these sort of general views that people have. So what I'll do in this discussion, and I've omitted the discussion of reviewing the paper for the sake of brevity, I'll raise a question is that I think in the comment that Alex had just a minute ago, that the sacrifice ratio is it measured in employment? Is it measured in output gaps? And I think there's a political economy question involved here, and I'll show that briefly. I'll present some data that suggests that the Phillips curve the short-run Phillips curve may not have disappeared during the area that we call sort of the new global economy. And finally, provide a brief 1-minute lesson from history, just as a teaser for this literature. Okay, so what should policy be targeting? And is it the unemployment gap or output? So in this model, we have this representative agent. Everything is symmetric. There are no income groups, as Asaf said, and therefore we can apply sort of Alkin's law, whatever it is, that output gap, unemployment, these things are interchangeable. And but in fact, we know that this global economy has produced these technological changes and so forth that are associated with it. We have these low-tech, low-wage sectors and high-tech sectors. We have increasing inequality in many economies that went through this globalization process. This is part of the observed phenomenon. And again, the relatively recent, in terms of the terminology of focusing on output gaps relative to the more traditional focus on unemployment or these other measures when people discuss these policy or loss functions, I think relates to the fact that we actually are now more focused on consumption, on the kind of things that emerge from the model, as opposed to the more traditional concern with unemployment and the number of people unemployed and whatever's happening to them in some sense. What I show here is the correlation between output gap and change in unemployment. Okay, these are not perfect measures. So there are a lot of measurement problems with how you measure output gaps and how do you measure changes in unemployment. So here I've taken sort of some basic, very simple deviations from trend type of gaps, and to show these correlations in a set of the OECD countries that are used in the paper. But this is for a period which is definitely more globalized than the period that Ball had in this paper, which is from 60 to 89 or 87. This is already taking it into the recent era. And what I've plotted on the side, as you can see for this figure, is a measure of inequality, like the Gini coefficient. And what you can see is that in more equal economies, the Okun law thing, or the correlation between output gaps and unemployment gaps, is relatively high. So no matter what you focus on in terms of the policy, you get pretty much the same results. However, in countries that are associated with high inequality, the correlation between output gaps, or at least the measured output gaps, and the measured unemployment changes are much less strong, and in some places are even close to zero for this period that we're looking at. So in terms of raising the sort of the political economy issue, in terms of this welfare function, or in terms of this policy function, we want to make a distinction, or try to think about whether we want to care about unemployment or look at output gaps, and I think these kind of things matter. Another issue that I looked at is the short-run Phillips curve disappearing from the new global economy? And again, this is a very naive look at the data. And what I do is take the data, not the ones following the data used in the paper, taking it from 89 to 2004, and also splitting it from 98 to 2004, which is coincides with the introduction of the Eurozone, which again is something that should improve globalization and capital flows and so forth tremendously. And so again, these are periods that globalization intensified, and what you see is that, I'll show you in a minute, that this thing is still alive, that short-term Phillips curve, no matter what we think about it, is still alive. The sacrifice ratios, as you can measure them from those curves, have not changed that much through this last period. And again, specifying some sort of a naive reaction function for all these economies, some kind of a panel, you see that those are quite stable as well. So looking at the short-run Phillips curve, so the dependent variable is the change of the inflation rate, and then there's the unemployment gap or the output gap. What we can see is that if we look at OLS, we can see that basically the measures, this is the unemployment gap, this is the output gaps, are pretty much constant throughout this sample period. So even if we take the period of more globalization, so the more intense, the euro, whatever, we see that those coefficients are pretty stable. This is a panel of OECD countries with, this is OLS. If we care about econometrics, we do FGLS or annual bond, these things that take fixed effects and heteroscedasticity, panel-specific ARs, and so forth. What we see is that these coefficients are pretty stable, and you can even, well, they're even increasing in some sense, but they're definitely not declining between these two periods. So what you can see from a panel, again, maybe an individual country, maybe like the UK or some other specific country, this might be different, but if you look at the panel of all these countries, you can see that these trade-offs are basically constant throughout this period of intense globalization that we've witnessed. Again, this is a very naive Taylor rule, which again can either take the output gap or the unemployment gap. What we see is that the constant, which sort of the real interest rate, is pretty much fixed for this panel of OECD countries. It hasn't changed that much through the sample. What I find surprising is that the weight on the output gap has actually increased post-98 relative to the whole sample, contrary to what might be prescribed, and the weight on inflation has gone down a little bit. So in terms of the results, again, so if you measure things in unemployment gaps, we get a high sacrifice ratio than output gaps. This is because of this distinction between the two empirical variables that have changed. They're stable or maybe a little bit rising throughout this period. And the weight of the output gap and unemployment in the central bank reaction functions, again, using this panel, has actually increased following the disinflation, which is the data that is discussed in the paper. One lesson from history, before I summarize, is that during the previous era of globalization, the gold standard, central bankers at the core countries, which are equivalent to the OECD, basically pegged the price of gold to put zero weight on unemployment throughout this period. The Bank of England, so they never, throughout most of this period, did not pay any attention to unemployment, output gaps, and even measure output, and they didn't pay attention to these things. However, it's precisely during this period that the Phillips curve, whatever, the Phillips later on looked at this period where the traditional famous Phillips curve is really robust, is through this period of early globalization. So the previous era of globalization has produced the robust Phillips curve, and the question is, without any central bank intervention. And so the question is, do we want to learn something from the historical episode to the modern one? To conclude, so again, this is a political economy decision. I think whether you want to peg output gaps or unemployment gaps, I think this is something that's related to the internal political economy of each one of these countries, with the Anglo-Saxons maybe on one end, the Scandinavians or other Europeans on the other end in terms of their emphasis. The short-run Phillips curves are quite persistent. Central banks, according to this data at least, have taken sort of a different route from the one suggested by the paper, where they should have lowered the weight on the output gap, but they actually increased it in recent years. And the question is, perhaps we need sort of a different framework for central bank reaction functions or policy, which is distinct from a period of disinflation when you want to use maybe a cold turkey, very powerful measures to reduce inflation without caring for the unemployment gap, relative to periods of price stability where deviations of inflation are relatively low, and people are convinced that the central bank is committed to the stable inflation, and it's during this period that maybe the central bank, and that's what we see in practice, is maybe paying more attention in this panel to counter-cyclical policy than on reducing inflation, which has already been reduced. So there might be a distinction between these two regimes, the disinflation regime, and once we have reached the targets, maybe the central banks behave differently or have different pressures to behave in a different way. Okay, thank you.